works, to sum this all up, is that images vary over frequency. That's our basis set. The human vision system is sensitive to different frequencies at different amounts. So by doing similar to a Fourier transform where you take that integral or that sum, that dot product with the wiggling sinusoids, DCT is a variant of that, we can figure out the coefficients for each of the frequencies. Then we can threshold essentially or reduce the level of representation of the high frequency in order to save a bunch of bits in describing the image. All right, so that ends totally our lessons on frequency. I'll bet you're glad that's over. I know I am. As I said when we started this, if you were doing image processing as an electrical engineer, you would be doing a ton of work analyzing images in terms of their frequency content, and you'd be thinking about image processing operations in terms of their frequency behavior. We, however, will only do this a little bit because as computer scientists, we tend to think of images more as data structures than as signals, but we're still going to have to worry about things like frequency content when we try to do things like optical flow, where it's necessary that the image not vary very much over some distance of approximation that I make. So you'll actually have to do a filtering that sort of removes that high frequency. So hopefully you now have enough understanding of Fourier analysis and frequencies to be dangerous, and we'll go ahead and practice being dangerous in the lectures to come. So 3 is a new unit for us, and we're going to start talking about camera models. And it's going to start off gentle and then get a little rougher later, where we start to get into things like perspective projection. So just bear with us. In the middle, we'll do something cool in stereo, which you're actually going to do for a problem set, and it's pretty straightforward. But that's what this class will keep trying to do. We'll dive down into the math a little bit, come back up, try to make sure you always have the math you need for doing the problem sets. Some of the stuff we'll give you, you won't use directly on the problem sets for the assignments or even the exam, but it's important that you know about it. So what is an image? Well, up until today, we've been talking about images as functions. Remember, they were a two-dimensional function or a function of intensity of 2 dimensions, x, y, u, v, I, j. Today, we're going to start saying, wait a minute, it's not just an arbitrary function. These images are actually projections of 3-dimensional scenes of 3-dimensional points. Here is an example of the first known photograph. It's one of the first known recorded projections done in 1826. You can see the device here on the left, and on the right was a reproduction that was made in the mid-50s of what the image looked like. Now, what's remarkable is this image is called a heliograph. Helio sun, because it took a lot of sunlight in order to make that picture. A pewter plate, which is metal, was coated with something called bitumen of Judea, which is some sort of derivative of a petroleum chemical. After a day-long exposure, so like 8 hours, the plate's removed, and the image is found by, you have to wash it in a solution, a mixture of oil, of lavender, and white petroleum, which dissolved away the parts that had not been hardened by the light. So the idea was you have a chemical, it was a liquid that underwent a chemical reaction from the light that would change it, so then you could then remove some of it, and that's how you got an image. Those of you who've been fortunate enough ever to work in a dark room, it still has that principle of chemicals manipulating silver halide or some silver elements that are changed by light. Of course, most of us don't do that anymore. We use these fancy devices which have no soul, but which capture pixels better. What is a camera or an imaging system? So, simple definition is it's some device that allows the projection of light from 3 dimensions, 3-dimensional points, to some medium that will record the light pattern. That medium can be film or it can be a sensor, etc. But actually the key word to all this is projection. So here's a projection, some people walking on a sidewalk, and there's this globe-like thing in the middle, and something that might convince you that something is a little strange might be, there's a tiny little guy standing on top of the world. This was a pre-clip for the movie Titanic. That was a joke, tiny little guy, Leonardo DiCaprio is not so big. Okay, anyway. What's really in that picture is that. Okay? And the reality is, this picture wasn't actually the projection that you thought it was, at least some of you. So you thought maybe it was like this ball thing that you were looking at an image, and no, actually it was a flat thing that happened to be projecting into the camera. And that gives you an idea that when you do projection, somehow you're losing information, you're losing 3 dimensions, a third dimension, you go from 3 to 2, and we have to figure out what went on in that third dimension. Let's talk about how you might make an image. So here's an idea. Let's just take a piece of film or a sensor, and let's just expose it to the light. Do we get a reasonable picture? Well, and the fact that the title says image formation bad method should give it away. Well, this point on top of this cartoon pine tree, well, it projects a ray of light to some point on the film, but of course it also projects a ray of light all over the film. Likewise, another point projects all over the film. So one of the problems is that every location on the film is seeing light from all sorts of different places. There's no single value of light that comes from a single place in the world. So how might we fix that? Well, here's an easy way. Let's put in a barrier with a very small hole in it. So here we have this little hole, and it's called an aperture. Okay? And we're going to use the word aperture to mean a couple of different things, but in general, the aperture is a small hole that lets light in it. You might change the size. But here we have an aperture, and what that aperture makes is that each area on the film plane or on your sensor plane is seeing light from only one point on the object. So it is showing you the light that just came from one place in the world, which is what we're after. By the way, something to note here, and we're going to see this a lot more, is that the image over here on the film is inverted from what's on the object. So the pine tree would be upside down, if you will. The very first known camera, that is not something that the film recorded, but camera, dates back to Aristotle. And here's an image, and it's called camera obscura, which is from Latin, means darkened room. So those of you who speak any Romance language, comma, bed, camera from room, obscura, darkened room. By the way, there's a cool museum in Edinburgh called Camera Obscura, which is all about the history of cameras and photography. I highly recommend it, although I didn't go there because I was in the Scotch Museum. And here you see the idea of a room with also a small hole in it. Okay, that's the aperture, projecting on a white wall in the back. In fact, there was a nice quote from Da Vinci. I don't know how you get quotes from Da Vinci, but I guess he wrote them down. Or maybe it was on Memorex tape, I don't know. It says, when images of illuminated objects penetrate through a small hole in a very dark room, you see, on the opposite wall, these objects in their proper form and color, reduced in size in a reversed position owing to the intersection of the rays. Okay, and that's what we were showing before. And by the way, those of you who think about lenses and focal length, the focal length of that system was the depth of the room. All right? So how does that aperture affect the image that we see? How does the size affect the image? Here's a demonstration taken from Paul Bobick's website of making pinhole cameras. And you can see on the left that he actually took a piece of foil and he's mounted it directly on an electronic imaging system. On the right is the picture that was produced using this camera, and presumably he had to worry about leaving the shutter open long enough to get the proper kind of exposure depending upon the sensitivity of the sensor, and we're not going to talk about imaging and sensitivity in this course. The first thing you might notice is, boy, that's an awfully blurry picture. And the question is, why so blurry? We just said that when we put a really small hole, it only lets a single ray of light in, and so it should be nice and crisp. Well, the problem, of course, is that there's small and then there's small. And so the question is, how big should the aperture be? So here is an actual rendering using a pinhole type camera, where they're showing you the different size of an aperture in terms of millimeters, and the ability to see a crisp image on the other side. And you notice when it starts out at 2 millimeters, you get a pretty blurry picture. And another way of saying that is 2 millimeters is large compared to the rays that you want to try to capture. And then it goes down to 1 and 0.6, and finally 0.35 millimeters gives us a pretty nice rendition. So the question you might ask is, well, why not make the aperture as small as possible? I mean, the smaller I make it, the smaller number of rays that get through and the crisper it will be. And the answer lies in, let's see, somewhere in physics. Maybe you played with water tanks where you cut little slits and you pushed waves through them and you caused ripples to change. And then you learned about something called diffraction. okay, and how waves interfere. And with light, what happens is if you make those holes too small, you start to get diffraction effects. So at 0.35 millimeters, we had a nice crisp picture, but then things start to go bad, and then when it gets even smaller, not only are we getting less light in, but we're starting to get things blurred out again. And that's because of diffraction effects. So you have to worry about those kind of things if you're making pinhole cameras. The rest of what we're about to do for this lesson is just talk a little bit more about some of the properties of image formation in lenses and cameras. Actually belongs more in a course called computational photography. And my colleague Irfan Issa at Georgia Tech teaches one, and there are others online. And it teaches you sort of the math of photography. I'm only going to talk a little bit about it here, because next time we'll sort of run back and revert to a very simplified model of imaging and do a much more complicated notion on recovery of computer vision. So the first thing about computational photography is, well, we don't actually use pinhole cameras, right? We use lenses. And lenses have this notion of focus. And in general, lenses are designed so that all the points at a particular distance away will all be focused to the same point on your film or on your recording medium. One of the challenges there is that another point that's at a different distance away, so here the blue point on the tree, they're not all going to be focused at that point. They're going to be sort of spread out a little bit. And in fact, that spread is referred to sometimes as the circle of confusion. If it's a single point, there's a circle that it cuts out. So the way you change where things focus and how much is in focus have to do with changing the shape of the lens. So talk just a little bit about lenses. Sort of our slightly simplified view of lenses is as follows. One is that lenses have an optical axis along which light passes straight through, unbent. The other is that light that comes in parallel are all bent to the same point, and that's referred to as the focal point. The other thing is, in order to reduce the amount of spread and things, lenses also have an aperture. But now the aperture, instead of being just a single point, is restricting the set of rays that are coming in. It used to be that almost all lenses were cut out of parts of spheres because we understood the mechanics of that and were easy to make and you could do the math. But these days there are many what are called aspherical elements because it's all computer modeling. We'll talk about that just a little bit at the very end. In computational photography, it's common to make what's known as a thin lens assumption. So a thin lens assumption is basically the drawing that I just showed you before, where we say, okay, for a given lens with a given focal point, it's going to image some object at, let's say, distance d0 at some distance di, or for d for image, back. And the question is, can we predict from the focal point what the relationship is between d0 and di? Well, obviously the answer is yes, or I wouldn't have been wasting all this film, or I waste your time. So here's a thin film lens diagram taken from the slides by David Forsyth for their textbook. And we're going to use that to derive the relationship between the distance in the world, and which we're going to call here z, away from the center of the lens, to the distance z prime, which is where the image will be focused, and the focal length f. First, just to be clear, here is some point P that's at some height y, since we're just going to look at the side. We're going to assume that it's projected at some point P prime, that is y prime off of here. And here is our focal length f. All right, the idea is that all parallel rays are going to intersect f, okay, which is why this one goes back here this way as well. All right, so when we have all sorts of parallel lines and that are going through the same point, it's easy to reason about what's going on here using similar triangles. So here we have our similar triangle, and it basically says that y is to z as y prime is to z prime. Two things to note here. First of all, I only use the magnitude of z and z prime because we're only going to worry about the length. And I probably could have used the magnitude of y prime, but just to make it clear that the y value is inverted, I said negative y prime as being a positive value. So if y is positive, then y prime would be negative. If y is negative, then y prime would be positive, and thus the negative sign. All right, so that's our first similar triangle. Our next similar triangle is here. And that says, and this one's a little bit trickier, again, the ratio between y prime and y is the same as the ratio between z minus f, so that's this amount, right? all of z minus f, is to f. So y is to f. All right, so just look at that a little bit. So y prime, size of y prime is to y, as z prime minus f is to f. So that gives us a second set of similar triangles.